For those that don't know, I'm Pastor Trent. I have the joy of being pastor here at Redeemer, and it's wonderful to have you with us, to come and to use this space. And I know we'll have the benefit of having this online too, so people can continue to feed on what is shared here this evening. So we just want to welcome you here to Redeemer. There are coffee, cookies, always the wonderful things to gather around afterwards that are prepared for you, so please stay and enjoy that in the fireside lounge. I was saying to Pastor Bill, I don't regret. I have a nephew that's playing trumpet that I need to be at this evening, and so I'm going to be there, but not with you for some of this evening. But I'll get to enjoy it online as well. So welcome. It's good to be here. It's good to be together, and we pray that your time together is deeply meaningful. I'm going to just pass it on to President Harrison here for introduction. So welcome.
Thank you, Pastor Trent, and thank you to the people of Redeemer Lutheran for hosting us. I'm Dr. Bill Harrison, President of Lutheran Theological Seminary, based here in Saskatoon, and we are very pleased to be able to welcome the Reverend Dr. Mercedes Bachmann this evening. Dr. Bachmann has a PhD in Old Testament from the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago. She taught for almost 20 years at the Ecumenical School of Theology in Buenos Aires and has one published book, Women at Work in the Deuteronomistic History. I'm going to have to practice that one. And several articles and book chapters. Currently, she directs the Institute for Contextual Pastoral Studies for the United Evangelical Lutheran Church in Argentina and Uruguay, and teaches online for Alma Mater and for other schools. We welcome Dr. Bachmann, and I'm sure that she will have more to say about who she is and what she does as she speaks to us this evening.
So thank you very much for, first of all, for this wonderful reception for us, for Bishop Rommel from my church and myself, and for coming tonight to share some reflections on being a Hebrew Scriptures / Old Testament Lutheran professor in a different context from yours. From what I've learned in these almost 10 days that we've spent here, there are important differences, but there are also several similarities between our both contexts and churches. Let me briefly introduce you to the Evangelical Lutheran Church. It's called United Evangelical Lutheran Church. If we can, there, thank you. It's a church that is located in two countries, Argentina and Uruguay. In this map, they look almost the same size, but Uruguay is much smaller than Argentina and is a bit northwest of the province of Buenos Aires, which is the one in where the yellow circle is right now. So in the map, you can see the places in which the United Evangelical Lutheran Church has missions or programs or projects of some kind. Like most of the continent, both countries were colonized by Roman Catholic Spain in the 16th century, and both achieved formal independence in the early part of the 19th century. We say formal because, in fact, still today we are so much bound by economic pressures and political pressures sometimes that independence becomes a very relative term. But formally, we are independent countries. In terms of state, Uruguay is a lay country, while this is not the case of Argentina. For instance, the second article in our constitution establishes or states that the Argentinian state will support the Roman Catholic worship or church, actually. So this is a right that no other church has in the country. Only the Roman Catholic Church has the right to be supported by the state. And that creates a difference both between Argentina and Uruguay, and also between the Roman Catholic Church and other churches in Argentina. Only with a change in the Constitution in 1994, not so many years ago, where other churches accorded the ecclesial status of churches. Before that, we were considered like any other non-profit organization, an organization. And that also brought some differences in how the church is organized in the country. Although for many, within the church, we would say we have a bishop, in reality, what we have is an organization with a council, with a president, a vice president, secretary, and so on, that is elected in an assembly and renews its terms every so and so years. So that's part of the confusion that many people face in our countries. These seem to be small issues. There are other, perhaps not so innocuous, what I call remains of Christendom within the system. Christendom means that there is a confusion between church and state, that there is a presupposition that the state is Christian. And therefore the church that is part of that state rules or pretends to rule for the whole country. For instance, December 8, the day of the Ascension of the Virgin Mary, is a national holiday. While not everybody is Catholic in Argentina, it is a national holiday just as Independence Day or any other day. That's one remaining mark of being a Christendom. Other less innocuous marks or examples are the pressure that the Roman Catholic Church has put on legislators every time a law was discussed that they felt would threaten their belief. From the divorce law discussion in the 1980s onward. Unfortunately, the last census of the country did not include any question about religious affiliation. And therefore, we do not have any idea how many people have dropped church, how many people still consider themselves Christians, whether Catholics, Protestants, evangelicals, etc., or even how many Jews or Muslims we have. We don't have any idea about which groups are growing either. And so this lack of information makes room for imagination. When you want to use some statistics and you don't have the statistics, you can imagine almost whatever you want. Now, you probably know that seminary professors are not very fond of imagination. And so I'm not going to imagine anything about these numbers. I'm going to leave it at that. But I think it is safe to say that Christians are still the majority, although many are nominal Christians. The people who go baptize their children, get married in church, perhaps go from time to time, perhaps become godparents of a child, but that's it. That applies not only to Roman Catholics, it also applies to many of our own people in these last decades. There is also a large Jewish population, a Muslim population that I think, without numbers, that is growing. At least you see and hear how people are joining. And there are some smaller faiths and beliefs, such as Aboriginal groups or First Nations with their beliefs, and some religions from Asia. In general, our tensions and struggles are not particularly interreligious, although this is not to say that people are not xenophobic or anti-Semitic at some times. But we haven't had large or serious threats or discussions or violent issues at home, except for an attack on a Jewish location in the 1990s, in which a Jewish location was bombed on a very busy day in a busy neighborhood, and the result was that there were several people killed. But it went unpunished, and every time a government has tried to either foster the investigation or keep the investigation from advancing, it is used politically. So it's really somehow muddled. In my opinion, this large Christian presence makes evangelization a very hard task, because the good news are not new. Everybody is supposed to know about the gospel. Everybody is supposed to know about Jesus. Everybody has heard the story of Christmas, even though they cannot differentiate a Protestant from an evangelical, for instance. And even though many are really not so well into faith. This means, in practical terms, that Lutheran churches are quite unknown except for particular pockets in the country, particularly in the regions we saw in the first map where the church has large congregations or diaconic programs. Much more are unknown female pastors in a world in which Pentecostals do not ordain women, Baptists do not ordain women, and Catholics do not ordain women. And therefore, the few churches that ordain women are few and scattered. We find ourselves, therefore, squeezed between groups that are much larger or much more vocal in their positions on social issues. And, ironically, these churches that are so different from each other, like the Pentecostals and the Roman Catholic Church, they come together in some issues, particularly issues that have to do with social issues, sexuality, some women's rights. They are together. And so, once again, the Lutheran churches and some other of the Protestant churches find themselves squeezed between these two groups. I'm not complaining. I've come to grips with that long ago. That's our society and our situation. But I thought it would help you understand a little bit that we are not in a majority. Also, we are not a large church. We are a small church scattered throughout the country. Argentina is not a wide country like Canada is, but it is a large country. And therefore, we have all kinds of climate, and still we have long distances between different places, but not so much through the same climate, but rather north-south. Now, the Bible in Buenos Aires. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So when I got this subject about what I should present tonight or what I would like to share with you, there was a question, can you, or at least I asked myself, can you be a Lutheran in an ecumenical institution? Let me introduce myself a little bit further than what was said. In order for you to understand what it means to be a Lutheran professor in an ecumenical seminary in a largely Roman Catholic environment. My vocation has always been pastoral, although I do enjoy teaching. I became a pastor and served several congregations before I went for my PhD at LSTC. And then when I came back, I joined an ecumenical seminary in Buenos Aires, which is the same seminary where we studied earlier in order to become pastors. It was called ISEDET, which is the acronym for Instituto Superior Evangélico de Estudios Teológicos. I think you got every word because they are very similar to English or to French. So the ISEDET was the ecumenical seminary formed by 9 churches. Among them, the two Lutheran churches, a United Church but from Germany, so Lutheran and Reformed, Anglican, Presbyterian, Waldensian, Methodist, Disciples of Christ, and some others. That seminary had in turn been the merger of the Lutheran seminary that was in the outskirts of Buenos Aires and the evangelical seminaries. And it became a reference for the whole continent. And therefore, almost anyone who knew the churches in Latin America knew this seminary. In the last years that I was there, it moved from being a seminary to being a university. In what sense? In that in our times, in order to study there, you needed your church endorsement. You could not study there if you did not have an endorsement by one of the 9 churches. In the last year, anybody who wanted to study theology could join. And the result of that is that I got to have all kinds of students, including non-believers, Jews, Roman Catholics, and so on. So that broad scope of students and of teachers gave it its particular flavor. As a Lutheran, I have always, or many times, met people who ask how to ensure that the Lutheran who goes to study to an ecumenical seminary will remain a Lutheran. And this is a valid question, of course. Now, in my view, it wasn't so much the seminary that ensured our Lutheran preparation as it was the church. We were well prepared theologically by the seminary, but in more general ways. There were particular issues like liturgy that were always taught by Lutherans or Anglicans because they cared for liturgy in a particular way. But most of the subjects were taught by somebody, no matter the denomination. So when the church wanted to ensure that we were good Lutherans, they would set up a professor who would ensure to give us particular classes about different issues in Lutheranism. But not only that, I also heard many times from many people, particularly women, and particularly Roman Catholic women, who would say, "You do not know how much freedom you have." And I always appreciated that because I tend to forget to take for granted freedom. Freedom of thinking, freedom of action, freedom to decide what with the tools that God has given, do you what you think is better. And not everybody can enjoy this freedom. So it has also made me much more appreciative of my own tradition as I talk to other people. The Christian faith and the Lutheran expression of it are not to be kept isolated away from many people as if we needed to protect them. What I also have found in my work as a professor and also in my studies earlier on in seminary is that you share your faith, you learn from the faith of others, and then you decide what makes more sense to you. And then if you have doubts, you go to your church and talk there these issues and talk out until you get, again, your thinking straight. And when you are a pastor, you will always, or many times, meet people who think differently. People who question the Lutheran faith, people who question the way the church does things, people who question the ministry, or how the ministry is set up, and so on. So I found it a very helpful exercise already early in my studies to have to say, why do I think this way? Why does my church do things in this way? And I've also always found it a good preparation for ministry and for meeting with people. So we don't need to keep our faith isolated in order to protect it, because faith does not need to be protected. And God does not need our protection. God needs our witness, which is very different from our protection. Now, if we move to the next slide, please. What I want to do now is to speak a little bit about the challenges to the Bible in Buenos Aires. The Bible in Buenos Aires is, as you know, the title that we chose for this lecture or for this presentation. And so, insofar as I live in Buenos Aires, we will be speaking a little bit about Buenos Aires, and also because the seminary was in Buenos Aires. But in fact, that's also a challenge because Buenos Aires is large enough to be very diverse. And the churches are also diverse in many ways. So what I tried to identify was issues that would make a challenge for ourselves, for our church first, and also for you tonight. Why? Because we don't have any answers, or we have partial answers, I should say, not known, but partial answers. We don't have answers to large problems such as God's mission that would fit everyone. And therefore, I think it's wonderful that we can just discuss these issues and share our different positions. Now, I say this also in the much larger scope, that we believe that the Spirit of God moves the churches and moves us as people. Creates faith, the Spirit brings together people who have faith, makes the church, or something like that, says the Confessio Augustana. I'm not a specialist in systematic theology and much less in English, but I understand that's part of what we teach and say. But you have also many biblical texts that speak of how the Spirit gathers us, moves us. For instance, Joel chapter 2, when the people of God think of a time when everybody will have visions and everybody will dream and everybody will prophesy. And so in that spirit and trusting that we can together have visions, it is that I present to you some of these expressions. I come back to the point I was trying to make earlier, which is that it is hard for me to ascertain the degree of Lutheranism that is within me. Because I studied in an ecumenical seminary and then I taught in an ecumenical seminary, and even in between, when I was in a Lutheran seminary, I had classes from several different points of view, and so that makes it quite difficult for me. I do know, however, that our theological context in Latin America is very much marked by Latin American liberation theology that was very popular in the 1960s and onwards. It was studied in the 1980s in our seminary, and ever since we have tried to practice it. Latin American liberation theology has a Protestant and a Catholic stream, if you want to say so, or phase. Its first mention, the first mention of the expression in written material comes actually from a dissertation by a Presbyterian Brazilian who wrote about liberation theology in the late 60s or beginning of the 70s. Liberation theology stresses God's preference for the poor and the oppressed. Just as God saved Israel from oppression or from slavery in Egypt, God keeps having a special heart for those in need. And why? Because sometimes or often, those people in need have no other helper than God. God cares for everyone, but God knows that some people need God more than others. And that's one of the points that liberation theology wanted to make very strongly. Liberation theology started also from the Second Vatican Council in the early 60s, because at that point, the bishops, Roman Catholic bishops came together and they said, how can it be that being a Christian continent, we have not been able to have our people come out of poverty? What happens with the church, with the power the church has, and the message the church has, when we have been the majority, we have been unable to produce large changes in society. And they then started to work on documents. They allowed people to form Bible circles, study the Bible in communities, and so on and so forth. So these movements have marked who we are even as Protestants. And while Protestants would not speak about bringing about the kingdom of God, as many Catholics would say, and definitely not of participating in order to gain salvation in any way, but God's mission from this perspective cannot preach while not working for the people. It's not enough to preach. What we need is preaching and doing. And if you were on Sunday in church, you probably either heard a sermon or delivered a sermon that had to do with these two aspects, doing and saying, being together by that parable that Jesus tells about the two children. Now, is this Lutheran theology? Is it Latin American? Is it even biblical? Well, I would start with a hesitant yes, but then with a resounding, definitely Latin American theology. And that is one large part of who we are in our church, even though we hardly speak in those terms and we take it for granted. Let me tell you very quickly before I move to the next point that unfortunately our seminary closed down in 2016, and therefore we are now walking in a new path. Since those 9 denominations that had formed ISEDET closed it down, the idea was that they would come again to start over. But you know, when you separate for a while and then you start to say, well, in fact, I would rather have this or that. In fact, I would rather have a graduate program rather than undergrad, and so on. Then it becomes very difficult to put a program together. So there are several attempts at this point, some by one church, some by some other churches, and there are also churches that have also chosen more conservative seminaries that do not belong to those 9 churches. Our church decided to try a new model, and I hope I will get time, or I make myself time to speak to you about that. But first of all, let me go to our point, our challenges or main challenges ahead. Can I get to the next? Thank you. So in 2019, right before the pandemic, I was invited to a consultation by a Roman Catholic university in Colombia to explore the question, where should theology go to in the Latin American context? And it was a wonderful consultation with 3 guest speakers, myself as a biblical scholar, another professor as a systematic theologian, and a third one as a practical theologian. And then the faculty came together and discussed those different issues. I had to think about what to present at that conference. I'm not a Catholic, Roman Catholic. I'm not Colombian. I'm a woman when the university is Jesuit, so most of the leadership is male. And so I first thought I need to be very careful about what I say. And then I thought, well, but they invited me, and they know me. So they knew they are taking a risk, if you want, or at least they want to hear what I have to say about that. I'm not coming to say what the Roman Catholics can tell them. So I decided that I would still be very careful and very respectful, but I would say what is my dream for that situation, for Latin American theology, but in the context of the Roman Catholic Church and universities. And then I did write 5 points that are the 5 that you have there. So the first point was that theology is to accompany the life of the church and of society, challenging and comforting, reaffirming and pushing, in constant dialogue with them, not as a parallel sidetrack or on an ivory tower. It's wonderful to have time to do your own research in theology, to be a professor and set up your programs, but the risk or the temptation is to not to listen to what the church needs or the church asks for, which might be the same thing or might be 2 different things, what the church needs and what the church asks for. So theology in the universities, in a Catholic or in a Protestant university, should accompany life of church and of society, because often our challenges do not come from church. They come from society, from people who have nothing to do with church but challenge us. That was my first point. The second point was that theology must keep being the voice of the voiceless. This is an expression very dear to liberation theology, be the voice of the voiceless. In what sense? That we should always be asking which voices are not being heard, which voices are silenced, which groups cry out and are not, but can only sigh and not utter their particular voice. Today we would say, let people have their own voice rather than be the voice of the voiceless. But at least we should always be very mindful that there are voices that are not being heard in our churches and in others. And therefore it is a task of the church to take up those cries and uphold justice. The third point that I made was that theology must forget about Christendom. And here I come back to what I said in the beginning. Christendom is the idea that church and state are the same, that the state, the state is Christian, and that the church has the right to expect the state to make decisions for the church or laws for the church. If it ever was, the world is no longer Christian. If it ever was. I have my doubts, but still, at least, it's no longer Christian. And this is good news, in fact, because Jesus never promised to be where millions gathered, but where 2 or 3 gather in small groups, where people really confess Jesus. Theology must place itself where it may listen rather than dictate, rule, or discipline. And when you're in power, when you confuse the state with the church, it's very hard to listen. And therefore, there is a role for theology. And from what I've heard here in many congregations and talks with several ministers of the Protestant churches here, particularly the Lutheran and the Anglican churches, is that part of this process of coming together and working together with others has been the result of realizing that that the numbers are decreasing. And somebody has said, well, if we were still so many, we would probably have more difficulties in working with others. And the same happens to us. We are so few that whether we want or not, we need to work with others. But in Spanish, we have a saying of making a virtue out of a necessity. You know, so the need or the necessity is, in this case, not to having large numbers of members or of pastors or students or whatever. And that finally brings out a virtue, which is working together, which is a witness that we should always be doing. Therefore, especially for the Catholic Church, it is extremely important that theology forgets about Christendom, that theology is ready to dialogue with others, to recognize that there are others, and to not to be always dictating or disciplining others. Fourth point I made was that theology must refrain from allying with patriarchy and with other worldly powers. This goes especially for churches that still refuse to recognize women's gifts to ministry, but it also speaks to us, Lutheran churches, that do not ordain women, but are steady, or that do ordain women, but in the end, when you go a bit beyond the surface, are still very much mindset by the patriarchal models that rule our society. We can speak more about that if you want to. Finally, theology needs to revise its ecclesiology and its conception of ministry. Although we boast of being horizontal in our decision-making programs and processes, we often regard the ordained ministry as superior to other forms of ministry. We often forget the concept of the priesthood of all baptized or of all believers, and we make a conscious or unconscious separation between people, lay people and ordained persons. And in that sense and in several others, we need to revise our concept of ministry so that it really is a concept of service rather than of power. Especially because that creates some problems with the diaconic ministry, which is a ministry of service, and also because in the end ordination is not a sacrament for us, and we should not forget that. So some years later, and a pandemic later, focusing on different denominations and looking more into my own church and the context in which our church, the Lutheran Church in Argentina and Uruguay, work, I think that these points are still valid, but I would like to add at least one more point. And that's the danger of religious fundamentalism. We should not forget not only that it's growing. I cannot say whether it's growing or it's only that people are becoming more vocal about that. I think it's also, there is a growing or a tendency in our own membership to become more conservative than they used to be. So in the last decades, we have become we have seen how religious fundamentalism has moved to become a subject in several political scenes. When I studied in the 80s, I remember having conversations with students, fellow students who were Pentecostals and who would not allow TV sets in their homes because it was from the devil. Now, not only they have TV sets, they sit people in Congress. So the shift from withdrawing from the world to being part of the political parties and setting agendas for the country is visible to whomever wants to look at it. I want to come. So this is a problem that affects particularly our churches, the Protestant, not only the Lutheran, all the Protestant churches, because it puts us again in a very weak position between different other positions that are much more conservative. And for a state that does not know the differences between one and another, or a society that does not know the difference, that makes it very hard to say, okay, we do not think like them in this issue or in that other issue. There are two areas in which this misuse is most evident in our context, and those are the issues of women's rights particularly, and especially women's autonomy in terms of their sexuality, their reproductive autonomy, and even issues like ordination of women, but also broader issues in society. And the second one is the prosperity gospel. These two areas are particularly difficult to counter. Why? In terms of women's rights, because again, societies tend to be conservative, even though sometimes the government passes good laws, some pockets in society are still very much conservative, and churches are even more conservative than the general population. And in terms of women's rights, they come together to try to curtail them as much as possible. And in terms of prosperity gospel, it's an area that is very difficult because even some of our people would tend to think that if something wrong happened to them, they must have done something. And it's extremely hard to work against that feeling because it's not a rational thing in the end. It's a feeling that if something happened to us at a particular moment, we try to find a reason to explain that bad experience, that pain, that death or sickness or whatever it is. And the other side of that same prosperity gospel is that it's very hard to speak to people who feel they have been blessed by God by having a new car, a new house, more money in the bank, and both have them understand that that does not have to do with the gospel, and also that there is a responsibility to be solidary, to share with many people, because it's in the end a social issue, justice. So these two aspects are some of those that are more difficult for us. Now, let me move quickly to some of the next points. Challenges to being church in our context, at least for our church, or what I have found out and what I've found from many conversations with many colleagues. Main challenges are these ones that we have been mentioned, together with decreasing number of membership, decreasing numbers of church attendance, decreasing offerings, decreasing money in church, and decreasing number of pastors. So when you put that all together and you try to project what will happen in the church in some years, you find that it's quite difficult to be very positive. But still, you find that there are options and there are opportunities in these new situations. So what are the goals for the next years for our churches? One goal is to recognize people's potentials and resources and to empower them accordingly. The church does not belong to pastors. We should know that and remember that. And sometimes we do, but we often pretend not to be that the case, and we forget about how many of the tasks of the church, of the witnesses of the church, of the service in the church is done by lay people. The church belongs to God's people even beyond the institutionality, and it does not belong to us. So recognizing potentials and resources and empowering them accordingly is one of the most important goals for the next years. Our church is a very small church, as I mentioned, and the church has 5 schools in the country. And in years past, the schools were not seen as mission posts, because the idea was that people would not think that we are trying to proselytize them. And therefore, they were seen as 2 separate fields, worship or church life and education. Yet, when you look at the time pastors spend in the schools with students, with their families, with teachers, with the principal and the other authorities in the school, with the people who are not teachers but have the school running, it's the whole week. And there are so many chances to witness to God's love, to the gospel, so many opportunities to walk with these people, to listen. Remember what I said earlier, the church needs to listen. And therefore the church finally said, this is nonsense. We are struggling we are counting ever less and less people, and on the other hand we have the same amount of people, and we do not consider the many hours we spend working with them or walking with them as church. So this brings about the question, where is church? Where does church happen? And that is not an easy question, because in theory, and I'm sure any of you could mention what the Lutheran confessions say about where church is or where church happens. But then in practice, in reality, we find that there are so many more opportunities for church to happen beyond the walls or the walls of our sanctuaries. And that requires that we recognize the potentials and the resources of every person around us. Second goal is to have a contextualized Lutheran identity. Because if we, I don't say that that's what we do, but if we were only repeating what the theology of the 16th century without contextualizing it for our particular place, it doesn't speak to anybody. And today we have to, if we forget the idea of Christendom, we should not take for granted that people know what grace means, what grace alone means, and so on. We should make sure that our witness is made in such a way that everybody can understand what we mean and what God wants people to achieve. Third is a contextualized ministerial model or models. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And that means that if the church is changing and our ways of being church are changing, we should also think how in church, with the proper order, with recognition of talents, with education, and so on and so forth, we identify those people who are today our ministers, or who may become our ministers. And finally, the fourth point is strengthening sustainable church models. For us, traditional congregations are not sustainable any longer. Buildings are very expensive and very large. Often they are not easily accessible to people, either elderly people, people with particular needs. They are sometimes hidden in such a way that in order to get there, you have to know where it is, and so forth. So we need to strengthen more sustainable church models, also in terms of people and leadership. So that what we really do is to provide spaces for people to reach us. In the past, the model was gradual change, person-to-person witness, and more a kind of action and reaction model. We would react to what people would say or need, and so on. Because that was also the Christendom model. People will come to us. We have the truth, we are the truth, we have the power, the money, the church, the sanctuaries. Let people come. But in fact, what we need to do is go to where the people are, with their needs, with their cries, with their questions. And that is not always within our four walls. Often we have found also that our ministry has more to do with larger issues, such as violence against women, laws that affect people, the environmental issues, different, many different needs rather than with people just coming to church. So I try to put here two models of mission. One is the earlier model, still very much present. And the second one is what I call new models. It's not necessarily only one model. Yes, evangelization will still happen person to person probably, but within a much larger context. Society changes faster than we do, and it takes a lot of effort for us to realize or recognize those changes and have a message regarding them. Social challenges to church are often what moves us, whether educational matters, gender issues, and economic, and so on. So meet people, but where they are, rather than expect them to come to us. Now, if we move quickly to the next one, regarding ministry, I mentioned already lack of resources for full-time pastors at each location, which used to be the traditional model. Each congregation had their own pastor. Shortage of ministers, shortage of traditional vocations, and shifts in job descriptions from traditional to more diaconic and also conversant with society. We have realized that many of us ministers do a lot of work that is not the traditional work we were prepared for. We were not prepared to mediate between conflicting parties within the congregation or in society. We were not prepared to do advocacy in a neighborhood between groups or on behalf of groups to the government. We were not prepared for student ministry like the one we visited yesterday. We were not prepared for reconciliation and truth ministries, whatever the need for reconciliation and truth. Here, it has much to do with the First Nations. At home, it has a lot to do with the time of the military regime and the victims of that regime. And there are several other needs and instances in which church finds the need to be present, but we have not been prepared for those needs. So what we have found out is that we need, and because education is free of charge in Argentina, you study at the university and you pay no tuition at all. So we find it makes much more sense for our church to have people prepared in a secular career, whatever that might be, and then complement that with a master's program. And of course, that would mean that pastors are less well prepared in the traditional theological issues or courses, but they would be conversant with society in other ways. If you're a sociologist, if you're a historian, if you're a medical doctor, if you are whatever, you have other tools. The challenge is coming back to that issue of recognizing the potential of each person. The challenge is how to use or put to good use those potentials or those that knowledge that the person has for mission. Many of our congregations here and there have the people that I call the person to go to. And I think we should have a ministry that is called the ministry by the person to go to. Because every congregation has at least one person that everybody knows and around whom the congregation always happens. The person that knows what happened before, the person that knows what to do next, the person that knows where are the resources, who is doing what, who is sick, and so on and so forth. And often we have overlooked the importance and the potential that that person has in that congregation. Now, that doesn't mean that that person will necessarily become a pastor. Maybe that person doesn't want to become a pastor. But that person is in church and has been in church forever and feels part of the congregation. And it is our challenge to look at that ministry as ministry. And therefore to recognize and bring to its potential the gifts that so many of those people have. Often pastors' wives and now pastors' husbands have had that traditional role. But often it's somebody who has been a teacher or some other thing all their life. And still they belong to that church as nobody else does. And they are ministers in that congregation. So we are thinking more of local ministers, local ministries, much more not only located, but also more contextual. Congregations in Argentina are very different from one another. Some are rural, some are urban. Buenos Aires is a world in itself. Uruguay is a very different setting, as I tried to show you in the first, with the first slides. And therefore, we feel no longer that we can confident to prepare ministers with a cut it all the same for all those different places. The great challenge for the church, one of the great challenges for the church, is how to prepare people for different ministries and to recognize those who are already there as ministers. And so, because I think I'm already in time, and if not, I'm almost on time, these are some of the questions that we have discussed in our church and that we still need to work on, and that maybe can help you. Are we ready to give up traditional models of ministry? Are we ready to try new models? How much personal or local flexibility should there be in trying new models? And still be Lutheran, right? Because we want to remain Lutheran. Are we ready for ministry teams rather than do it all burnt out executives? And now I want to bring the sign that I read in the street and in the, how you call it, there is a sign with a short word about probably the next Sunday's service at Redeemer, and it says something like, if you choose to be the orchestra director, you'll give your back to the crowd. And I thought, wow, I've never thought that in those terms. I'm rephrasing it as I remember it. There might be a better English way to say it, but it shocked me because it's really true. The orchestra director cannot face the crowd. So are we going to be orchestra directors? Are we going to face the people? Are we going to work with the people? And finally, are we training people for new models, particularly thinking of seminary life? Are we training people to work in teams with others, to recognize other models, to recognize other ministries, to work together ecumenical? We've heard a lot about that, and we celebrate that there are ecumenical models, but still we wonder how deep our willingness as churches and as ministers, and I'm speaking to myself in the first place, how deep we how deeply we mean that we want changes, because changes are always also difficult and challenging and threatening. So there is this component of it that is threat or feeling threatened. So as you see, I didn't bring much solutions to anything. I brought some questions that in my church have been discussed in the last years, and some models that we have been trying, identifying people in our communities that have the potential for ministry, a partial and located and contextual ministry, and probably not forever. People would have to have the freedom to decide whether they want that model to be part, or that ministry to be part of their life permanently or just for some time. But we have to also trust that the church is not ours, it's God's, and the church will never lack the resources that it needs. So it's in our responsibility to identify those needs and to bring the best that we can onto their solution. But in the end, the church is not ours; it's God's, and we should always remember that it's not ours. So I don't know. I might have left something out. I didn't know you, so I wasn't sure what would be appropriate or best for you for me to bring to you. So I'm happy if there are questions to try to answer them. I might say I don't know, but I might have some ideas to share. Thank you very much. So the question is whether the government collects taxes on behalf of the churches or gives money to the churches. No, the government does not collect a particular tax for churches or even for the Roman Catholic Church. Because of that article in the Constitution, the government takes part of what is collected of taxes and supports the Roman Catholic Church, just as it pays judges or policemen or policewomen or whatever. So it's part of those paid by the church. That means that the other churches only collect their own money by themselves. Since we do not ask for tithe, we don't tithe, and there is no tax system and there are some congregations, particularly from European origin, that still have the idea of a membership fee or membership amount. So some congregations still work on the basis of a membership payment to the church. However, the economical situation of the country makes it very difficult. The amount of money that has to be raised to support a pastor is also high because we are employees of the church, and that means that we will get pension and health insurance and so on, like any other employee, and that means a lot of money for any employer in that case. So very few congregations are able to support part-time, or I don't think any supports full-time their pastor, unless they have a school or some other project from which part of the money comes. And I didn't mention that, but Argentinians are very reluctant to belong to be members, to membership of any organization. So, thank you. So I didn't speak about membership much because that's one of the problems that we have. Everything goes well with the church until you start to tell people, oh, maybe you should become a member. And that's probably the last day that you see the people. Because it's not in our DNA, I think, or it's become very unpopular. So people do not want to be part of any organization. And therefore, the money is always an issue. People are generous when they give, but the whole situation of the churches, large buildings, tall roofs, lots of windows, leaking pipes and so on, those go far beyond what the congregation or the people can afford. There are wonderful examples where a congregation comes together to supply for a particular need for once, but in fact the national church has to face many needs, and therefore much of our income comes from buildings that are rented out, apartments or some other buildings that are rented out, and the schools charge a fee and tuition by which the school supports itself, and sometimes a pastor in the school and some other projects. But we definitely do not survive out of the members of the church. We could not, even if we wanted to, or even when we are generous, it would be too much given the situation in the country. So the question is, what do ministry teams look like? I can imagine different models or different teams. On the one hand, for instance, we have now a congregation in the north of the country which cannot support a full-time pastor any longer. And also the pastor they used to have is retiring, so they find themselves in a situation in which they cannot support a pastor. And in that congregation, for instance, a team of 4 people was set up. That's a congregation that has a rural area, an urban setting and a rural setting. And so what they decided among them is that they would work in couples, 2 and 2. One would be more responsible, one team would be more responsible for the rural congregation and the other team for the urban congregation. But when they cannot make it, they call on the other team. Now, that is basically a team that does service on Sundays, preaches on Sunday, and carries the Bible school, looks after the needs in the congregation and identifies the needs, does some diaconic work as they can, and when they have a new situation and they don't know how to handle it because they are new to ministry, they call somebody and say, Pastor, what shall I do with this? So those are all people who do it in their spare time. Those teams are all people ad honorem and who are working full-time. So it's really a ministry out of their generous hearts. In other cases, you have people more related to teaching in the congregation, to recognizing particular needs. There is a congregation that identified the need for a secondary school for adults who had not been able to finish high school, and therefore offer the church compounds for adults who have not finished school to come in and provide a meal for them and provide help in studying, for instance. And so it depends very much on the needs that you identify, the kind of team that you will get or set. Now, in every case, it's not that congregations will be left totally alone. Some pastor will be responsible for that congregation, even though that pastor might have 3 or 4 congregations and therefore not come often, or they might be far away. We have, for instance, in Patagonia, where Pastor Greg was a pastor, the closest congregation was 600 kilometers away. So in that case, it's not that you will go every week, but with phone or today even more with the electronic media, the congregation will have its own team, but they will know that they can count on the pastor. So models, there isn't one model. It depends very much on how the congregation identifies its mission or its role, or, no, not role, its role in that particular place. Some congregations emphasize worship. Other congregations emphasize more diaconic work or teaching Bible school or youth gathering and so on. So first, I think the need is to recognize where church is happening in that congregation and what are the particular needs for that particular space. And the other thing that I meant to say is that with these new models, ministerial models, there is the need for continuous education, especially because, well, it's always good. I mean, pastors have to keep studying also. Doctors study their own life. You would not go to a doctor who studied 50 years ago and never again took a book or went to a conference or anything, right? But sometimes we believe that in church everything is possible without any preparation, and that's not the case. So these teams would need particular I can't remember the word in English or in Spanish now, that you don't leave them alone, that you accompany them, that they are helped in their way. So there would be somebody walking with them that path.
Financial trouble with Argentina and the lack of trust for banks because of what the government did a number of years back to abscond with companies that were American and exchange stuff. How has that financial turmoil carried over to the church? And like in some countries there have been like cooperative movements to set up financial supports for people who have less. Is there things involved, the church is involved in that kind of area?
Okay, so the question is about the financial situation in Argentina, and particularly the situation or how the society perceives the government and the institutions to be corrupt, particularly banks and the government, and therefore how does the church deal with that, and what possibilities does the church have? So there are different answers or different aspects to that question as far as I know. I'm not in the church government, in the church governance, or I'm not in the council. That would be my colleague, Bishop Vilma, who is there more than myself. But from what I hear and gather, there are certain issues that, because the church to the state is a non-profit organization with its rules, its budget, that has to be approved and so on. There are certain things that cannot be done. So we need to take that in consideration when we follow the rules. Like, for instance, you cannot pay a pastor without the appropriate deposit made in the bank with the receipt and everything. You cannot just give money away without the appropriate documentation and so on. The other problem is that because the country, the government 4 years ago, the then government took a large loan from the International Monetary Fund. Money that never reached Argentina, in fact. So it was given by the Monetary Fund, but it got lost somewhere and never reached us. But we still have to pay for it and for the interests. And that has created a very difficult situation for the government and for the people, because the debt is enormous. As a consequence of that, there is no possibility in this, for people in Argentina to buy a foreign currency, except if you can prove with lots of papers, and then the government approves that you acquire a certain amount of foreign currency. But that's most of the cases. That's not the case, and that puts the church in a difficult situation when it needs somehow to go outside. Somebody has to go outside or has to make a payment outside. Now, it's much easier to get money from abroad into the country, like, for instance, when the churches in the States or in Canada support a project of ours, but then the money is converted into our own currency. And with that, we usually lose an amount of money. But there is no other way that we can do that except through the official channels, the banks, and so the foreign ministry, and so on. So, and on the other hand, we know that there are many of our people are hard-pressed to survive daily, and particularly during the pandemic, because the government locked us for months, and there was no way to go out and work except if you were armed forces or health personnel. That meant that many people could not work any longer. And therefore, in that times, the churches came out and bought food, gave out food, cooked food, and gave people food. We usually do not give money. What we do is try to set up projects by which people will be able to survive and to move on with their lives, for many reasons, because it has more to do with our own concept of how to deal with people and make subjects out of the people. So, is there still mistrust of banks? Yes, I would say so. Is there mistrust of government? Yes, more in some groups than in others. Are there troubles or difficulties? Yes. Yes, we have more than 100% inflation rate annually. So it's really very difficult to survive. And for the institutions like the church, who has to pay us salaries, it's also a problem. It's a problem for us as people, but it's also an institutional problem. And sometimes, like now, we know that the next month will be very hard because we have elections this year, so it will be a very stormy year, but on the other hand, there is not much that we can do about that. Pray and also try to make congregations realize that they have to be solidary, to help as much as they can, even though they are not rich themselves. And they do. Congregations are very good at identifying needs and then trying to come up with creative solutions. So I don't know whether that answers your question, but yeah, it's not always easy. Yeah. And on the other hand, for instance, the church has often difficulties in getting money. For instance, we have buildings that are rented out, and then people would not pay us, or in the schools, people would not pay tuition. But then the government is on our necks very, very quickly when we do not pay what we have to pay. So it's really very hard sometimes. I know Pastor Vilma has not slept many nights trying to solve this kind of issues. So it's not easy. Yeah. By the way, I wanted to mention, it has nothing to do with this, but we have one of our schools that is having getting a new kindergarten building, and that's a project that the ELCIC is supporting. So we're very happy about that. We have a large school, but it needed a new kindergarten, and we, on the other hand, had a lot of space that was not well used or needed to be rearranged. And so this is one example of a wonderful win-win situation, because we have a new kindergarten and a building that is put to a much better use. And we got support from the ELCIC for that. So it's also the kind of enterprises or of exchanges that we need from time to time. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bachmann. I want to say that I deeply appreciate your words this evening. I anticipate using portions of what you said today in a group tomorrow in conversations about the kinds of people that we want to recruit to seminary and the ways in which we need to form them in seminary, because many of your thoughts feed into the kind of conversation that we're having about the way in which we need to be able to think about new forms of ministry and new ways of preparing people for new kinds of possibilities. The list of challenges of which you spoke feels very close to home. That's very much a lot of the challenges that we face. So thank you. I want to say that this has been tremendously valuable.
Thank you very much.
So, bit of a thank you to you. And thank you very much for joining us.
This will go to the church. So thank you very much.
And just before we move on at all, I also want to welcome Bishop Wilma Rommel, who is president of the United Evangelical Lutheran Church in Argentina and Uruguay. I think I got that right. Mm-hmm. And so welcome with us this evening.
Thank you very much. Very glad to be here.
And so now come and join us for coffee, tea, and cookies downstairs, and maybe some more chance for some more conversation.